Welcome to Isabella True Crime Meaning Stories channel. We hope you will have fun with us. Enjoy watching. I couldn't understand why it scared me so much, why the tension in the air suddenly felt so obvious. I tried to pull my leg away, but his hand lingered slightly. It all felt so accidental, but at the same time, incredibly aware. We both froze, and for a few seconds it stretched out like an eternity. His hand stayed on my knee and I could feel the warmth of it. There was nothing simpler than that touch, and at the same time it was something so foreign that I wanted to stand up and leave right away. But I stayed in place. And maybe he sensed it, because after a moment his hand slowly, cautiously moved back. I wanted to say something, but I couldn't. There was something different in his eyes, something I couldn't even explain to myself. It wasn't just regret, not just an apology for the accident. It was a look that spoke of something deeper, something that couldn't be put into words. Maybe he realized that this moment was important. Maybe I did too, but all I could do was pull away and tell myself that it wasn't that important. And then, after that brief pause, he apologized, but his apology was sincere, and I knew it wasn't just a response to an accident. His gaze still lingered on me and I couldn't look away. I didn't want to admit it. I didn't want to think that he might feel the same way I did, but inside something was already stirring something. I couldn't shake off the entire next day. I felt as though something had tightly squeezed inside my body, leaving nothing but emptiness. Everything seemed the same. Sophia went about her business. Alexander, as usual, returned from work, but I couldn't shake off the tension left by his touch. Every time I met his gaze I felt something boil up inside me. But I couldn't understand what it was. Evening came and once again we all ended up in the living room. Sophia, seemingly unaware of anything, sat with a smile, bombarding us with her jokes, and I sat there trying to act like everything was fine, but inside everything was bubbling. I couldn't even tell what scared me more. Alexander's gaze, which seemed to have become more persistent, or my own feeling that I was probably losing something but couldn't understand what it was. Sophia. Alexander and I sat down to watch a movie again. Sophia, as always, made herself comfortable in the chair with a cup of tea. I sat next to Alexander now with no space between us. I felt how his body next to mine became so unbearably real, and in that moment I realized that I couldn't stay the same anymore. There was something elusive between us, something that overshadowed the familiar boundaries. Soon Sophia fell asleep, lost in a sweet, carefree slumber. Alexander and I were left alone. I couldn't stop the thoughts that tangled in my mind. Why couldn't I just forget about this? Why did his presence stir such strong feelings inside me? I tried to push those thoughts away to focus on the screen, but I couldn't concentrate. Then he leaned slightly toward me, his breath warm and palpable. I felt his body getting closer and closer to mine, and I couldn't ignore the fact that between us there was some kind of line, one we both knew. But neither of us dared to cross. But he made the decision. His hand touched my shoulder and then slowly glided down to my back. It felt so natural, so imperceptible, that I didn't have time to understand what was happening. I froze, unsure of what to do. My skin tensed, but at the same time there was a strange feeling inside, as if I couldn't push him away, but I couldn't accept it either. I couldn't shake the feeling that if I stayed everything would change, and so unable to bear the pressure anymore. I turned to him. We were face to face and I saw in his eyes the same anxiety I was feeling. We both stayed silent, but that silence was filled with something greater than words. He leaned toward me and his lips softly touched mine. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a kiss where there was no time, no place, only the three of us and what was happening between us. I didn't know what to think, what to feel. It was a moment when I lost all sense of reality. The only thing that existed was us. When I pulled back, it became hard to breathe. Everything inside me had been turned upside down, and I felt as though a heavy weight of responsibility had fallen on me, as if I had crossed a line that there was no going back from. Alexander looked at me with the same expression in his eyes, a mix of apology and something incomprehensible. We both sat there silent, not knowing what to do with what had just happened. I couldn't believe that this had happened, and yet I couldn't erase it from my life. With each passing day I became more and more lost within myself. Sophia's house, though cozy, with its warm scent and soft light, couldn't give me back what I had lost. But at least here, in this little corner, I didn't have to be alone with the burning thoughts that never left me. When I was by myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that despite all the comfort surrounding me, I was still living in some temporary refuge where the only goal was to get through the day and not think about what had come before. When Sophia suggested that I stay with her, I couldn't say no. It was a decision that didn't require much thought, even though I knew that in this house I would always feel out of place. Nevertheless, Sophia always had a way of making me feel at home, even if only for a while. Once we had laughed together, made plans for the future. But now I had become a guest in her life, as if I had stepped into someone else's reality where everything felt so familiar and yet so distant. The next day I arranged my things in Sophia's room. It was all so simple. I hung a few photos, folded my clothes in the wardrobe. But even these familiar actions brought me no relief. There was an emptiness in them that could not be filled by any action. When Sophia left for work, I was left alone. The house grew even quieter. I sat at the table looking at her old photographs, thinking about how things might have been different. The weather outside was cold, and the sunlight filtering through the curtains cast a dim, uncertain light. In that moment I suddenly felt myself drawn into something heavy, invisible but real loneliness. I no longer hoped for a miracle. I didn't expect life to suddenly change, and it was then that I met Alexander. In the evening when Sophia returned home, her husband was sitting in the living room. I had known Alexander since the time when Sophia and I were younger. He had been her husband for a long time, and while we maintained a good relationship, I had never paid him much attention. He had always been the kind of person who, in the midst of her constant cares and conversations, seemed to almost not exist for me. But today was different. He noticed me immediately and I felt his gaze. It was soft, attentive, as if trying to understand what was going on with me. I couldn't figure out why this feeling made me uneasy. After all, Alexander was just a friend, my sister's husband, an ordinary man with whom I had shared many dinners or watched movies. But today I noticed something new. There was not just politeness in his eyes. It struck me as strange. Sophia. Alexander and I had dinner in silence and I felt so vulnerable that I couldn't relax. Alexander was telling a story and I couldn't help but notice how his manners and voice calmed me. He spoke calmly with interest, but at the same time with distance, as if he understood that I was going through something important, though he couldn't quite grasp what it was. And at some point I realized that in his simple words and gaze, I was missing something else, that very care I had long been yearning for, but I couldn't admit this to myself. How could I? After all, it was Alexander Sophia's husband and I had no right to feel what I was feeling. Still, I understood that I hadn't felt simple human warmth for far too long, and maybe that was what drew me to him. That evening was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a long day when everyone is a little tired and just wants to relax. Sophia. Alexander and I sat down to watch a movie in the living room, and suddenly I felt a strange awkwardness, even though we had been together before. Even though we all knew each other well. I felt an invisible boundary arise between me and Alexander. One I couldn't cross. Sophia, as usual, settled into her spot on the couch, the same spot. She often took her eyes glued to the screen, and I sat next to Alexander with more space between us than usual. But as soon as the movie started, I realized I couldn't take my eyes off of him. His shoulders, the arm resting on the arm, retest his movements. Everything seemed so ordinary and yet so significant. I could feel his presence starting to affect me. Even the simplest moments when he laughed, when he talked about something trivial, felt incredibly important. I tried not to pay attention to it, but I couldn't help it. As time went by, Sophia fell asleep, succumbing to her tiredness, and I was left in the dark room where only the light of the screen illuminated our faces. My eyes involuntarily traced his figure, catching every little movement. I didn't know what to do with it. At one point, when I slightly shifted to rest my arm on the arm, retest his hand accidentally landed on my knee. I froze. He seemed not to notice, but I felt a tightness inside me, a strange feeling growing within. It wasn't just awkwardness. It was something much deeper that I couldn't explain. The silence in the house was unbearable. Every corner of it seemed as empty as Dave's promises, which he continued to break. Day after day I sat on the couch staring out the window, listening to the sounds that brought nothing but mundane silence. Today was January 14th, our anniversary, and once again, just like last year, Arthur didn't show up. I thought that at some point it would stop hurting this much, but he didn't come. I tried to tell myself that it was okay, that each of us was busy with our own life, that he had important things to do. But with each passing day those excuses became more and more forced. And today, sitting on that couch, I realized that none of these words were actually helping. Through the window I saw the first snowflakes beginning to fall outside, hanging in the air like little soft stars before landing on the ground. But I didn't have time for them. I couldn't remember the last time we were truly together, not just in the same house, but really together. It had become the norm. We didn't talk, didn't laugh, didn't share our thoughts. And with each day I felt the coldness between us growing. He said he would be back late. As usual, I thought, but before I could even realize it, that thought consumed me completely. There was no feeling of resentment left, only anxiety pressing inside me, like an inevitable shadow that follows every step you take through the window. I caught a glimpse of movement again. The sharp cold left no hope that he would be back on time. But finally the door opened. I heard his steps, quick and confident, but so unfriendly, so empty. He entered without a word. I didn't know what to say. He took off his jacket and hung it in the hallway. His gaze didn't meet mine. He didn't even notice. I was sitting there in the corner motionless. I felt the lack of words, how there was nothing that could fill the silence. I suddenly understood that I couldn't bear it anymore. We had long lost all connection and I didn't want to keep waiting, hoping that one day he would understand how hard it was for me. "We need to live separately," I said, surprised at how calmly those words sounded in my mind, as if I had been preparing for this moment. And strangely enough, I felt that those words were the final step I had to take. Dave froze for a moment, then nodded. He didn't ask why, he didn't object. He said nothing. It was so simple, too simple. I stood up, gathered my things and left. I stood in front of the mirror in the hallway, preparing to leave, and stared at myself for a long time. The face I saw seemed unfamiliar. It was emotionless, almost detached from what was happening, and I felt my heart tighten. I couldn't understand what scared me more, the fact that I had decided to leave, or how easily it came to me. Goodbye, our home. Goodbye, our conversations, which had long since disappeared. It all ended so quietly, without explosions, without passionate words. It was all simple, as if there had been no place for explosions and passions in our lives for a long time. I put my bag over my shoulder and took a step toward the door. The silence still rang in my ears, but now as I opened it, cold air met my face. I didn't look back. I just needed to leave to escape from the feeling that pressed against my C*******T. At first I went to Sophia. My sister had always been the person I could turn to when everything around me fell apart. We were like three halves of a whole, always understanding each other without words, sharing joys and sorrows, even when miles apart. But today I felt that even she couldn't make it any easier for me. I didn't have the strength to seek comfort in her eyes. When I arrived at her place, Sophia wasn't home. I entered the empty house where the smell of freshly baked goods immediately filled the air for a few seconds. I simply stood there, looking into the room where everything was so cozy. So homely. It felt strange to be here because this house was filled with warmth, something my life had lacked for a long time. It was like a place where one could hide from all the troubles. But for me it wasn't salvation. I was alone again, searching for something I hadn't felt in a long time. Minutes dragged on and finally I sat down in the armchair and closed my eyes. It was so hard to shake off the feeling that something important, something real had gone and I hadn't been able to hold on to it. Thoughts about Arthur, about us, about how I would never be able to forget how things used to be, kept spinning in my mind. Then I heard footsteps. Sophia was back. She was holding a basket of warm rolls and a familiar smile appeared on her face as if nothing had happened. "Hey," she said, noticing me in the corner of the room. "I'm so glad you came." I remained silent and she understood, setting the basket on the table. Sophia sat down next to me and simply stayed there. Sometimes in moments like these words aren't needed. The silence that fell in the room after Alexander and I pulled away from each other felt hypnotic. Everything around me seemed to freeze, and in that dead silence there was something unbearably heavy. Sophia was still asleep, but I couldn't relax. My thoughts kept circling around one moment, the kiss that had just happened in his eyes. There was not only sincere apologetic anxiety, but something else, something I couldn't identify. Late at night when Sophia was softly snoring behind the wall, I woke up with the sensation of another presence. I lay there staring at the ceiling and suddenly I heard footsteps in the hallway. It was Alexander. He knocked on the door and I quietly whispered, "Come in." Alexander entered the room, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. He didn't say a word, simply sat down at the edge of my bed. The room was dark and only the faint light filtering through the window illuminated his face. "You're not sleeping." His voice was low and tired, but there was something insistent about it, something I couldn't understand. "Shouldn't have done that," he continued, not meeting my gaze. He looked at the floor off to the side, as if he were afraid to look me in the eye. I was silent. It was hard for me to believe I was in this situation. Now it couldn't be real. And yet here I was with him in this space, where everything now seemed impossible. He came closer and almost without realizing it, his hand was once again near me. I felt its warmth cover my shoulder. I froze in that moment, everything I had tried to suppress. All my fears, desires and doubts rushed to the surface and I realized I couldn't hold myself back any longer. I couldn't fight the feeling that there was something deeper between us. He didn't say anything, just leaned in and kissed me. It was a kiss. I couldn't stop. It wasn't like the one before. It was different, much more persistent, slow burning. We couldn't stop and I didn't want to either. With every passing second, I lost my sense of time, getting lost in the kiss like a whirlwind that carried me far away from everything I once knew. We only pulled away from each other when we could no longer breathe. In his eyes I saw something I hadn't expected. Not just guilt but desire and something more. He looked at me as though this wasn't just a moment, but something far more important, something we couldn't ignore. Morning came so quickly that I didn't have time to realize that everything had changed. I woke up feeling a heaviness in my C******T, as if I were carrying an invisible burden that became increasingly unbearable. With each passing moment, my gaze darted around the room trying to find something that could restore my former clarity. But there was nothing, only a strange feeling, as if the events of the night had dissolved into the air, leaving behind emptiness. When I turned my head, my eyes met. His Alexander was sitting at the edge of the bed, his face as tense as mine. We didn't speak, and that silent moment, which would normally be just a second, felt like an eternity in his eyes. I saw regret and something much more complex, a feeling I couldn't decipher. I felt a storm growing in my C******T, but I couldn't figure out what to do with it. Every thought about the kiss, about what had happened last night, was like lightning striking my heart. Leaving behind a trail of guilt and despair, he broke the silence for the first time. "I'm sorry." His voice was quiet, almost inaudible, but his words cut through me like a knife. I didn't want things to turn out like this. I wanted to scream, to tell him that it wasn't simple, that I didn't want this, that I didn't know how to live with it now, but instead I just stayed silent. What could I say? How could I explain that now I had no words to justify myself, that I felt guilty not just toward Sophia, but toward myself as well? I don't know what to do now. His eyes lowered and he stared at the floor as though he too were trying to make sense of this tangled mess of emotions. When I returned to the room, Alexander was standing by the window, his back straight. But I knew he couldn't help but think about the same thing I was. We were both trying to ignore what had happened, but between us there was no longer that light that had been there before. We both knew something was broken. He looked up, meeting my gaze, and I felt that familiar tightness in my C******T. Again. It wasn't just remorse. It wasn't just regret. It was the feeling that our world had changed and we couldn't return it to what it had been. "I have to leave," he said, almost in a whisper. It wasn't a suggestion, but a decision already made. I knew it wasn't just words. He had to leave because we both understood that there could no longer be any simple, normal communication between us. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't speak. I just stood there looking at him as everything inside me crumbled. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, move and remind us all of the beauty in life's unexpected moments. Hit the notification bell so you never miss another heartwarming tale. Thank you for watching and we'll see you in the next story.